Welcome to this episode of What I Want to Show You. I'm Char, a teacher, administrator, and education leader who lives in Ohio, and I am here with my colleague, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I've been in education in some form or another for the past too long, more years than I want to mention.
And we're going to spend the next 30 minutes sharing what we want to show you at the intersection of ideas and experience. We realize that despite our very different backgrounds, locations, and experiences, we have a lot of commonalities we didn't expect. So we thought that you might have some as well, and we'd like to share ours with you today. Well, today, Laura, I thought we could talk about like the context of water and crossing water and how that like fits into thinking about our lives, because I just spent the past few days on Put-in-Bay, which is a little town on South Bass Island. And South Bass Island is one of the 5 larger islands on the west basin of Lake Erie. And Lake Erie is part of the Great Lakes water system. And for people who don't live near the Great Lakes, I find I'm always having to explain to them like exactly how large Lake Erie is. I live a block from the shore of Lake Erie, and so often people are like, well, can you see the other side of the lake? It's like, no, you cannot see the other side of Lake Erie. No, you cannot canoe across Lake. Well, I guess you could try to canoe across Lake Erie on a calm day, maybe at a narrow point. But I think it's difficult for people who have never seen the Great Lakes to like fit that into their schema of what like lake means, because for them, lake means something completely different. And my guess is that's true for you.
For me, lake is something that you can swim across, and not as an Olympic swimmer, just as your average, relatively reasonably fit swimming human. You can canoe across it, but you'd probably want to go around in circles because it's not going to be very far to canoe across. When we think of a lake, we think of something that you could probably throw something if you threw it hard enough to the other side. If you so for me to wrap my head around a lake that's like an ocean, you mentioned waves on a lake, and that is something that I absolutely cannot wrap my head around, because we have to have gale force winds to have waves on what we consider to be a lake. So it's completely different. And even though I can understand the words you're saying, and you've been kind enough to send me photos and videos, it's still not something that is in my frame of reference.
Yeah, when we talk about waves on Lake Erie, and Lake Erie is one of the shallower of the Great Lakes compared to Lake Superior, which is considered to be an inland sea. Lake Erie can easily, on a day when the winds are out of the northeast and are blowing pretty strong, easily have 3 to 5 foot waves. Those are small craft warnings, but wouldn't be unrealistic to have 5 to 7 foot waves and
Okay.
crashing
Here's
against the
again.
shoreline. And like, no, you don't take your boat out that day. I mean, there are ocean bound freighters that travel through the Great Lakes system. So I'm sure that the lakes you're talking about, there's no freighters on your lakes.
No, that would be hazardous to say the least. Um, I don't know how they would get there either. And I don't know what the point would be, because you can just canoe across with whatever you want to freight. Again, but I can't visualize 5 to 7 feet because I think in meters.
All right, so 2.5 to 4 meters.
Okay. Now see, that I can imagine. That's pretty big.
Right, they are pretty big. And you know, there are stories about famous shipwrecks on the lakes. Probably the most famous shipwreck was the Edmund Fitzgerald. That was on Lake Superior. It went down during a horrible storm. It was a large freighter. and it sank. The theory is that maybe the hatch covers had not been secured properly and some of the hatches filled with water. But that is a legendary song about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But there's all kinds of shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. Even here off Cleveland, there's some shipwrecks, some old schooners, and there's a ship that was carrying Model Ts that sank in the lake. So Model T cars that's still sitting out there. So, there's ore boats that come through the lake from Michigan on their way to Cleveland and then through Buffalo. Gravel boats, grain boats. So it's part of the waterway commerce system for the United States and Canada, because the Lake Erie shares a border with Canada. That's why I sent you pictures this week of an island. You can see from the island that I was on. You can see Pelee Island, and Pelee Island is in Canadian water. So Lake Erie is a multinational lake.
It doesn't compute for me. Even though it just doesn't, that's kind of like when you show me a picture of an island that you can see from another island. It's kind of like me looking at Robben Island from the shore. But Robben Island is closer. I can make out the buildings. That's my only point of reference for like a landmass that isn't. I mean, people do swim to Robben Island, so it's still not quite that far. I wouldn't swim to Robben Island because the water's extremely cold, apart from other things. But some triathletes and things do. But that's the closest I can come. That's why I think that this is such an incredible analogy, actually, for our lives. Because there are things that, even though I can understand them intellectually, they're not part of my frame of reference. So I can explain experiences to you, and you can do the same for me. And even though we do have these intersections that we've uncovered, there are still things that just they require quite a bit of imagination.
Well, and I do think it's a good analogy because there are experiences that people have, or places that people have access to, or knowledge that they have that is so far different than other people that they may be networking or connecting with, that no matter how hard you try to explain it, or how many pictures you show, or explanations you give, or examples you come up with, it's still difficult to fully comprehend. And I think that's why I've enjoyed our conversations. I mean, we've said this before, but there are just some things that, unless you could come here and I could stand you on the lakeshore and say, look, here you're standing on a Lake Erie beach and there are waves washing in today, and there's a freighter out there on the horizon, and you can't see the other side of this lake in any direction. I don't think it makes sense to you. And like that, for us as humans, I think that's a challenge to overcome, because my lived experience growing up along the shores of Lake Erie, and I've been on Lake Erie and around Lake Erie for my entire life, is very different from your experience growing up in Cape Town, South Africa, and being around the ocean and the mountain and the cultures there. Like, you've explained them to me and you've sent me pictures, and I've got an idea, but I don't have a feeling about the scope of Cape Town, or the how the ocean there acts differently than the Atlantic that I see on my side of the Atlantic, or that my city looks very different from the city that you described to me. And we keep finding little pockets that are similar, but so the need to, when they talk about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, I think that's why you do have to travel to different places and actually be in person with people, because until I come to Cape Town, I don't think I could ever fully comprehend Cape Town. And even then I wouldn't. I mean, we'd be there for a visit. And likewise, for you to come to Lake Erie, you'd get a snapshot of it and I could drive you around, but you wouldn't really see like the whole Great Lakes system. But I think it would be closer, like that need to really connect with people at a far deeper level than just sharing ideas, like actually digging into the work and spending time with them in that space, I think is so important.
And I think understanding that you don't understand, it's not enough. It's a first step, but it doesn't mean you can stop there. And so many people do. Like, okay, I don't understand, and that's fine. Acknowledge that. That's all well and good. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to build the understanding, because, like you said, if I saw it, that would be a step. And then if I lived there for a little while, I'd probably understand a little bit more about what it is to be in that environment and to have that different reality, because it's actually just a reality. It's a completely different reality. Everybody's lives are, I think I'm going off topic right now, but everybody's lives are such a different reality to what we can imagine. And it often boggles my mind, it always has, to just think of like being somebody else and experiencing what they experience in the way they experience it. It's a thought experiment, but I could never actually fully do that. You can never really fully walk in somebody else's shoes.
No, you can walk alongside them, I think. But I think about learning in general. I mean, you and I, Laura, for our career path, think a lot about instruction and instructional design and learning opportunities and putting that together for people. And the difference between, I can show you how to do something and you can read about doing something, or you can watch a video or a movie or YouTube about somebody doing something. But how much better the learning is if you actually do the something, where you're doing it yourself, is far more effective than reading about it or watching somebody else do it. And it takes so much more time to have those kinds of opportunities. But I go back to doing my best to help you understand what a Great Lake is like. I've shown you pictures, I've sent you videos, I've given you descriptions. But until you're actually here in the lake yourself, you don't have that like deeper learning moment. And I think that applies not only to academic things, but cultural pieces. You can read about other cultures, you can listen to their music, you can look at their art, but until you actually go and sit beside them and eat the food and listen to the stories and hear about the traditions and understand their family and why pieces are important to them, you can't really fully appreciate that. And it makes it easier then to discredit or discount or minimalize or marginalize different groups of people because you've only done surface level understanding of what they're all about, if that.
I think that thinking you understand is the greatest barrier to understanding. And just because you've eaten, I was going to use words that you weren't. So we have
Use them anyway.
putu. It's I think it's what you call grits.
Okay.
So it's a maize porridge, but putu is not made like a porridge. It's made very, very dry, so it's kind of crumbly. It has the texture of like really dry mashed potatoes. So it's crumbly and you can mold it. And it's usually often served with stew. And it's quite a traditional dish. Eating that does not mean you understand the culture. It doesn't even mean you understand the full spectrum of culinary culture. It doesn't mean that you have this window. And the thing is, you will always be outside looking in. But you can knock at the door. To take this analogy to a completely overblown, and you can speak to somebody, you can understand, you can ask questions. So what I did is when I was at university in a different province, I decided to learn the dominant African language there, which is Setswana. And what I really appreciated was that the language professor, he didn't only teach us the language, he also taught us certain basic customs. So not customs, but just so that we, there's a very real possibility of putting a foot in it, for example. And he showed us certain things to do. So if you end up at a homestead, there's a certain call you give. You don't just walk in, because then you're like an invader. There are certain
Right.
things you need to say from outside. You call, and you call in a certain way, which means, is anybody here? Can I come in? Kind of thing. And for example, if you travel slightly north, South Africa is not, they say it's not really Africa because it's very urbanized in a way. But if you go a little bit north, you go into sort of still sub-Saharan Africa, but you go into slightly more rural areas, and you want to ask for directions, you will not get any directions if you ask for directions. It's hello, how are you? How is your family? How are you? How has your week been? Otherwise, you're exceptionally rude. And I remember even just being young and having a car full of white teenagers and my best friend who was not white. And we asked for directions of people alongside the road. This is in Cape Town now, which is super. And we got nothing, blank stares. And she finally said, well, all of you just shut up. I will speak to the next person we see. And we got smiling directions. And it's but this wasn't even that kind of situation. It was a completely different situation in Cape Town. And it wasn't even in a rural area, but there was it wasn't the same as asking after the person's family and all of that. It was a completely different context, which will sound completely strange so I'm not even going to start with that, trying to explain that. But these small things, these are the things that I think these are the things you need to learn if you hope to gain access to a broader perspective. You need to just be able to knock in the right way.
Right. Knock on the right way. Choose the right boat, right?
Right.
I'm not going to take a canoe across Lake Erie unless I'm an explorer and I'm really trying to demonstrate that you could do this if you followed along the shoreline. And
I'm not going to try and take a container ship into Seekoflay, no.
Correct. So it's like understanding the larger picture and then choosing the right vehicle to get you into that space or that culture, whether the right vehicle is the right language choices, the right the right actions in the right order that you take them, the right food, the right understanding of who to address in a family or where to sit when you show up, or all of those things. I think go back to it's really difficult to understand what's the right boat if you really can't even imagine that body of water to begin with. Like, you can't make that choice until you have the bigger picture. And why it's valuable to take the time to really learn that, like that your professor took the time to talk to you about more than the language. Like, this isn't a language course. Here's some base things that you need to understand to even begin to wrap your head around this cultural pool and what that means and what it looks like, so that when you go there, you don't fall overboard and you don't drown, because you've at least got a starting point for wading into that culture.
I think it's about communication, because he taught us to communicate beyond the language. And I think that's where everything starts, right? Communication is so much more than language, and it's so much more than speech. We've spoken about language and so on, but there's so much more. there's interpretation, there's beyond idiomatic language and things like that, and shared histories and shared contexts, there's communication. For example, I once had somebody use a language to ask me something. I wouldn't have even understood it was a question if he hadn't given us that background.
Right. And then it comes back to communication and asking follow-up questions and understanding body language cues and what works, what eye contact to make or not make. And
That's a
where
big thing. Eye contact.
Hand gestures you should make or not make, or in America the personal space is relatively small, and handshakes are an expectation when you first meet someone. You shake their hands, you look them in the eye, you're well within personal space. That is a very American communication piece, not an effective communication piece elsewhere, for sure.
No, I mean, there are areas here where it is incredibly rude to look somebody in the eye. If you have any respect for somebody, you will not do it. And I remember meeting the Queen Mother of the Royal Bafokeng and asking my aunt, who was well, she wasn't really an aunt, she was my aunt's husband's sister or something. I don't know. She was somehow vaguely related by marriage. She was friends with her and she invited us to tea. And I remember asking her, like, all these questions about how to convey respect. I mean, this lady's royalty. I didn't want to be disrespectful, but I didn't understand how to do that. So I had to ask her a whole lot of questions. It's difficult to understand where those intersections are. And I think that is the key. Asking the questions. Okay, I was going to go off. I keep digressing.
I'm pulling you back.
Yes, you do pull me back so well. But I mean,
I like what you're sharing there, because what do we have in common, and how do you keep yourself and what's important to you while you're adding new experiences onto that? How do you make those connections back to you and your own life experiences, your own culture, your own frame, while you're living in someone else's, or while you're intersecting with somebody else's? And how do you decide, like, what's respectful in terms of actions and words, and what would come off as insulting because you're mimicking something or you're trying to replicate something without fully understanding the context or importance behind it? So, where's the line between respectful and insulting? Because
and appropriation.
And how do you bring your own world into that world? And are they open to that? I mean, your story about tea, she was open to that. She had an expectation that you were coming to have tea with her, but that you were bringing some of your own cultures and traditions and context with you. And there wasn't an expectation that you take all of that off and leave it outside the door.
Yes.
So I think that is a challenge. And the more global our world is becoming, the larger the challenge that is, because I think there's such a fear that everybody's lake is going to look the same, right? That we're just we're not going to have things that make us unique. That, this global space, we're all expected to become similar, when in fact, I think it's the opposite. That we can so expand on our own lives by taking time to dig into what's different and unique about somebody else. I mean, this conversation started today talking about what lake means to you. Lake for me has a much broader definition, because we have small lakes in Ohio, and we have ponds, and you certainly, there's Pymatuming Lake and Mosquito Lake and Portage Lake. There's a lot of smaller lakes that you can still take boats out on, but are more in line with what you think about when you think about a lake.
Mm.
What you don't have is Lake Erie, because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And so I think helping people make connections like, okay, your idea of lake is this, my idea of lake is more expansive than yours, because I've had an opportunity to see lakes that are very different from what you've seen. So go back to your tea reference. She's inviting you. You had the chance to go have tea with her. She had a much broader context of the world. You said that she was very worldly. She had seen all these different things and could accommodate them. There was room for you to be in her space because she, in her mind, made room for you and was open to accepting you and your traditions and background into her space, because she was able to make room for that.
And it also meant that I could benefit from, she made a real effort to make me feel comfortable, even though I was quite awed by this lady. This was many years ago, and I was this young, idealistic woman, and it was a big tea. It wasn't like just us. That would have been quite something. I was comfortable enough to just listen and learn from her. She's a remarkable woman who has been integral to keeping the whole fabric of the community alive. She's a diplomat and charities. She has charities and fundraisers. She lost her husband, who was the king. Then she lost her eldest son, who had succeeded him, and she just keeps living for her community and for her. It's an amazing thing. She's an amazing lady, and she gets a lot of respect from a lot of people. And for me to be able to just be there and to just benefit from her experience and her experiences in her lives and her sharing. I remember she gave everybody a recipe for carrot cake as a gift. And it was her secret recipe. I learned so much about leadership just from the few times that I got to be in her orbit. But if I'd been completely obsessed with not causing offense, I wouldn't have been able to do that. She made the space for me to be impacted by her. So yes.
Well, and maybe that's a good lesson to end on today. We started off talking about having different ideas about what a lake was, and that unless you actually experience something yourself, it's difficult to really build a deep understanding of something. And that transitioned to a conversation about having the space and providing space so that when you do meet with someone new who's bringing new things to your world, not only do you have room to learn from them and to hear what they're saying and learn about their stories and their experiences and their culture, but you are also giving them space to be themselves and learn a little bit from you. Not putting up the total wall that says, well, you're here today to learn from me, and my expectation is that's what's going to happen, and I'm not learning anything from you. Or I want you to completely set aside who you are so that you fit into my world without bringing anything from your world to it. I'm glad we took that kind of detour, because I think it's a related concept. How do you ever possibly build or grow your understanding of something if you can't be open to experiencing it, sharing your own self and your own experiences with that, and then coming out the other side much richer and fuller because of it?
It's also about, I think it's being generous with your context, you know, letting other people share it and bring their own experiences to it. So yes, I think that is a good note to on. There is one more thing I want to say before we finish. I think that it's important to always ask questions because 90% of people are not going to be offended by an attempt to understand.
Right. And legitimate, like sincere questions, not judging questions. Like
No, 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 obviously. But to
seeking
understand.
to understand questions.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is absolutely a good thing to end on today. So we know that there's so much more to see than what we shared today. And we'd love for you to show us what you see or use our conversation today as an opportunity to share what you see with others and ask some good questions to explore. Laura, I'm always happy to talk with you. I'm glad we had a chance to connect today.
So my thank you, Char, and thank you to anybody who has listened and who is going to carry on the conversation.